Hello, my name is Jacob White. I'm a creative writer and also a communications and technology student. I am very passionate about storytelling, and I'd like to talk to you today about plot lines and what they are. Well, we mostly know what plot lines are, but how exactly they're structured and how they're made to work. While we're talking about that, I would like to mention, first off, that this is also part of my Capstone Project. So, I will be talking a bit about that at the outro, but uh, for your sake, let's go ahead and talk about what is a plot structure. A plot structure is essentially the point A to point B of how you get somewhere within a film and or TV series. However, normally it goes a little bit like up, down, out. It's kind of built like a mountain, where we have the little walk, the climb, the tippy top, climb down, and out. That's essentially the structure of a plot. But I want to talk a bit about the intricacies, about like why it looks like that, what exactly it's intended to do, and kind of give you a frame of reference as to why it looks like that, why it behaves like that, all of that. I've made a couple of adjustments on my version of this, particularly because there are some little bits and bobs about it that I'm going to talk about later, which I specifically wanted to use in a more visual format. So I made a couple adjustments. Some plot mountains, so to speak, look similar to this. I am mimicking that slightly, but not all of them will look like this. So if you see one in the future and you go, that doesn't look right, you know why. I've made some adjustments, taken some liberties. In order to kind of deconstruct something, that can be used to show you the point A to point B of really looking into plot lines. I will be discussing the movie The Batman throughout this film. I hope that you have seen it, but I assume that most people have seen it considering how big it was in the box office. I mean, it is The Batman. To start off the plot mountain, we need somewhere to really begin in the story. And of course, that is called the beginning. Wrong movie! The beginning in status quo is where we are being introduced to the setting, to the main character, to what's going to happen. It's called different things depending on where you look, because sometimes it's called the hook, because this is where you're getting people interested in the characters and getting them interested in what's going to happen. Sometimes it's called the status quo because it is setting the pace for the rest of the film. This is where we are setting up, okay, here's how things are kind of gonna look and go, or here's how things used to be before this happened. It is the setting up of what is to come. The beginning is your introduction to everything, to the story and how it's going. In the case of the Batman, it introduces us by showing us Gotham. It doesn't just show us the setting, it shows us Batman. It shows him beating up the bad guys. It shows him getting in there and being involved in what's happening in Gotham. It gets us invested in a sort of world where Batman is the most feared thing, and it gives us one of the most prominent lines in the movie.
I'm vengeance.
And really introduces who he is, how he relates to the world, what he's been doing all of this time, and what makes him important to it.
Fear is a tool.
The next part of our plot line is going to be the inciting incident and or the call to action. The inciting incident and or call to action is entirely built on this is the moment that everything starts to go into our full main plot. We go from a status quo, this is the norm, this is where we are, this is where your average everyday moment to moment happens, and the hook that got you in at the beginning, to the actual, okay, here's where things are starting to happen, here's where our story's actually begun and really beginning to pick up. It's called both the inciting incident and the call to action because, in some cases, the call to action is a bit more fitting. The call to action is something that would be used in superhero films or fantasy stories because a hero is called to act and do something in some given situation. The evil overlord is taking over the land. The big bad guy has started attacking people. This crazy event is going to happen and you're prophesized to deal with it. It can be any number of things, but inciting incident is more common because it's not always a call to act. Sometimes it's just a bad situation you're in. Say the main character finds that they're in debt suddenly, and that their great-great-grandparent was in debt and somehow the debt falls to them, and they have to figure out how to get millions of dollars within a week. That's an inciting incident. This person is called to act technically, but it's more fitting to call that the inciting incident, which is why that is what it's called more often than not. In this case, it can be both a call to action and an inciting incident, as the Batman is called in by Commissioner Gordon in order to deal with a crime, a mystery that has started to come afoot. The Riddler is about, and he has just killed someone towards the beginning of this film as we were introduced to things. Now we are being asked to dig into this mystery and we're starting to get invested in the story. That's the key part of the inciting incident. It takes what we already know and it begins the cycle of investment. It begins to take our interest and get us into what we want to see for the rest of the film. I mean, yeah, the story's really good, but dang, those action sequences. The inciting incident is intended to lead into the rising action. I've talked about that a fair bit already. That's because the rising action is where most of the film is taking place. Most of the film is taking place in the midst of a rising tension. There are problems being created. There are things that are going wrong, things that we are concerned about. There is a lot of emotion that's being built up and generated within us through the story in order to show us the difficulty that characters are going through and in order to truly present the conflict, which fundamentally is what a story entirely is based on. Here is conflict, events happen, and due to that, our character changes, grows, fights, survives, and lives throughout that. And that is the most beautiful and important part of any given story. If you do not have conflict, you do not have a story. That being said, the rising action as we see it is going to be shown differently in different films and different stories. In a romance story, the rising action might be the main character trying to gather the interest of such and such individual, trying to get them to look and pay more attention to them. In another film, the individual might be trying to complete a heist, and the situation gets more intense as the heist goes on. In the case of our Batman film, we have a few very specific ways that the rising action is taking place. We have this first hill coming in when we start digging into the mysteries and figuring out what it is that's going on in the midst of this whole Riddler debacle. Who is this guy? Why is he doing what he's doing? How is he doing what he's doing? All of that. Then in the midst of that, we also have the bit of, as the first bit of tension goes up, we are going into, the Riddler doing this, doing that, and then it gets less interesting. And it might just not be like constantly keeping your attention. So new conflicts, alternative, smaller conflicts, will then rise up. We have parts like where Batman starts to wonder how his effect is, how he's affecting the world and how he's affecting other people. Then we have the moment where we meet Selina Kyle, and Selina Kyle, as it turns out, is actually an okay person, but now she has her own struggles that are now getting involved as we're untangling the mystery. It turns out the problems that she's had are directly related to problems in the film, questions about the main character's parents and everything. All of these lead into things that build up the action. And every time you overcome some difficulties, you may find that the climax, the bigger difficulty, is somewhere out there in the distance. As you crest this peak, you start to realize Selina Kyle's got investment in this, and now we're invested in her, and the story isn't just about Batman anymore. Now it's about Selina Kyle, it's about the city of Gotham, it's about how everyone is doing, and whether or not everyone's going to be okay coming out of this. Now we get to the brass tacks. Now we start to understand where everything is going, and when we get to the peak of our tension and the action and where everything comes together, we reach the climax. This is not the final battle of a film. I'm not about to say that this is where Batman starts beating the crap out of people, because that's not always the climax of the film. The climax is where everything begins to feel the darkest, where the characters are at the moment where we don't know if they're going to get out. In a tragedy, this is the moment where everything has gotten absolutely ruined, and you realize that there is no hope for return. Then we lead into the falling action. The falling action is going to be where everything starts to get resolved. In stories with superheroes in them, or with hero-like characters in them, normally this will be the part where the hero starts fighting the bad guy and we start to see the hope at the end of the tunnel. That all of the emotions that we've had up until this point, they've resolved whatever quarrel they've had with their teammates or other individuals, and everything starts to relax. In the Batman, perfect example of this, we can see in our climax that after we've discovered Selina Kyle's problems were this and that, it was actually Falcone who did this and that, and we realize at that moment when the Falcone confrontation happens that finally she is willing to move away from revenge. That finally she's able to move on with her life and be someone different. Now you could also argue, and this is dependent on different people, that the climax of the film is the moment where we find out that the entire city is going to explode, and then it just happens. I would personally say that although, since the climax is normally towards the midpoint of the film, it's probably the confrontation between Selina to Falcone, I would say personally that the climax of the film would be when the water starts coming in and everybody's in danger. Because at that point, everything, even the things that we thought were originally resolved, are no longer and are now threatened completely and totally. Even Catwoman is in danger. The falling action is where everything starts to get resolved. Those final battles where the heroes stand up to the darkness, the moments in a film where we finally see our characters about to defeat the bad guy and finish everything up. That's the falling action. Our emotions are beginning to get resolved and beginning to get dealt with. So, in the case of the Batman, I would say that this is where that final fight happens, where the final fight falls. This is the falling action. We now know that every difficulty that we have can be resolved and can be dealt with if we can only get out of this fight and really make sure that everyone is okay. If the Batman lives, if Selina Kyle makes it out, if the mayor survives, if the now Commissioner Gordon is able to continue doing his work, if everyone gets out, everything will be okay. Now let's get to that denouement. Denouement? What's denouement? It's French. A denouement is the ending. It is the conclusion. This is where we end up getting our little epilogue. Here's where the characters are today. Everything's done. The action's over. All of the things that the action has set up are completely finished. The tone is relaxing. The denouement is very similar to the status quo. The status quo sets up okay, here's everything that's happened, here's where we are now. And just kind of letting you sit in this moment of recognizing, here we are, here's how everything's gone, here's how everything is going to go. In a TV series, at the end of an episode which hasn't ended the entire arc of a story, but might have finished the arc, the rising and falling moments, which it's another way of talking about the plot mountain. It's the arc, the rising and falling of the action and the events that happen. At the end of each and every episode's mountain, you will reach a denouement, but this denouement, in this case, is just a simple flat line, still with some of the tension from before, but kind of a completion, knowing that we are towards the end and that this is where the ending is happening. Sometimes they leave you all the way up here and they're not even going to bother bringing down any of the tension. That can be rough. That's your cliffhanger right there. You bring up all these events and you bring up all this crazy stuff happening, and then you just don't resolve any of it. But in a normal story, and in a film specifically, the denouement is going to be down towards the bottom, back where the status quo was. Everything's been brought back to normal, everything's been finished and completed, and we are just reaching the ending. And at that, that's the end of this video. Now that we're at our denouement, I would like to invite you to talk down in the comments about what you've learned. As this is a part of my Capstone project, I'd like to do a bit of an experiment with you. If you would, take your favorite moments, the things that you remember the most, from whatever your favorite film is or otherwise, comment them down below and mention what part of a plot mountain they were a part of, as you imagine. I'll interact with you below and we'll have little bits of conversation about this. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them below. Anything to discuss or talk about, please add those and I'll talk with you on that. Later in the week, I'm going to post a additional bit to the description here, and there will be a survey. After all of this is done, I would like for you to take that survey and take the things that you've learned from this video and we'll see how much you remember, how much you don't. Try to do it without watching this video again. Please do not watch this video again while trying to do that. That will ruin the point of the project that I'm working on. I would just like you to be able to take the survey, let me know how I did, whether or not I did good or bad teaching, as well as how what exactly you learned, and this will help me identify what was good, what was bad, and how effective this was for you, so that we can learn something from this. Either way, it'll teach me something as to, like, does this method of teaching work better or worse than certain other environments? Or does this need some tweaking and can it be better? Please let me know, and thank you for your time.